An unexpected courtroom twist has completely changed the trajectory of one of the most closely watched murder trials in America. For days, the courtroom has been consumed by one question. Was this a tragic act of self-defense, or an unjustifiable killing that ended a teenager's life? Now, just as jurors prepare to decide the fate of former track athlete Carmelo Anthony, a series of dramatic developments has left legal analysts stunned. The defense has abruptly rested its case. The prosecution has declined to call rebuttal witnesses, and perhaps most significantly of all, the defendant himself will not testify. As both sides prepare for closing arguments, new questions are emerging about witness credibility, surveillance footage, and whether the defense's version of events can withstand scrutiny inside the jury room. Tonight, we're breaking down the explosive new turn that could determine whether this case ends in acquittal, conviction, or something no one saw coming. The case centers around the fatal stabbing of fellow student and track athlete Austin Metcalf during a Texas track meet. Prosecutors allege that an argument escalated into deadly violence, ultimately resulting in Metcalf's death. The defense, however, has argued that Carmelo Anthony acted in self-defense during a rapidly unfolding confrontation. Throughout the trial, jurors have heard emotional testimony from dozens of witnesses, including students, coaches, law enforcement officials, forensic experts, and individuals who were present during the chaotic moments leading up to the fatal encounter. But after days of testimony, the biggest surprise may have come from what never happened. Many courtroom observers expected Carmelo Anthony to take the witness stand. In high-profile cases involving claims of self-defense, defendants sometimes testify in an effort to explain their state of mind, describe perceived threats, and directly address the jury. That never happened. Instead, after presenting only a handful of witnesses compared to the prosecution's much larger case, defense attorneys unexpectedly rested. The announcement immediately sparked speculation among observers following the trial. Why end the defense so quickly? What happened during the lengthy delay before proceedings resumed? And what strategic calculation led attorneys to conclude that their client should remain silent? Legally speaking, a defendant has an absolute constitutional right not to testify, and jurors cannot treat that decision as evidence of guilt. However, in the court of public opinion, such decisions often generate intense debate. Some legal commentators believe avoiding testimony prevents damaging cross-examination. Others argue that when a case hinges heavily on a self-defense narrative, jurors sometimes want to hear directly from the person claiming they feared for their safety. Now, that explanation will never come from the witness stand. Instead, jurors must evaluate the defense's claims using witness testimony, physical evidence, surveillance footage, and attorney arguments alone. And that's where the case becomes even more complicated, because one of the defense's key witnesses may have unintentionally created new problems for the defense strategy. According to courtroom testimony, a student athlete described seeing commotion near the area where the confrontation occurred. The witness suggested that tensions were escalating and initially characterized the scene in a way that appeared potentially favorable to the defense. But prosecutors quickly challenged that account. Using surveillance footage shown repeatedly throughout the trial, prosecutors argued that portions of the witness's recollection did not match what appeared on video. The witness ultimately acknowledged that some details of his memory may have been inaccurate. That admission instantly became one of the most discussed moments of the defense case, because in a trial where seconds matter, even small discrepancies can have enormous consequences. And now, jurors face a difficult question. Should they trust eyewitness memories formed during a chaotic and emotional event? Or should they place greater weight on surveillance footage that defense attorneys argue may not perfectly synchronize every moment shown on screen? That battle over perception versus video evidence could become one of the most important issues deliberated behind closed doors. But the surveillance footage isn't the only piece of evidence creating controversy. Another witness focused attention on a question that has followed this case from the very beginning. Why was a knife present at a high school track meet in the first place? And the answer, or lack of one, may become one of the prosecution's most powerful arguments as the trial reaches its final stage. One issue continued to loom over nearly every argument presented inside the courtroom: the knife. From the very beginning of the case, both supporters and critics have focused on a simple but emotionally charged question. Why was a knife at a high school track meet? The defense called a law enforcement witness who testified that under Texas law, possessing a knife with a blade below a certain length is not necessarily a criminal offense. Legally, that testimony may have served a very specific purpose. It gave jurors context about whether the mere possession of the knife itself violated state law. But prosecutors were never arguing that simply possessing the knife was the central issue. Instead, the focus remained on how that knife was allegedly used during the confrontation. And perhaps more importantly, why it was there at all. Throughout the defense case, jurors heard explanations regarding the weather, athlete movement around the stadium, and events leading up to the confrontation. Yet, according to courtroom observers, the defense never fully addressed why the knife had been brought to the track meet in the first place. That omission could become significant. Because when jurors enter deliberations, they are often left to fill in unanswered questions with the evidence available to them. And unanswered questions can sometimes become just as influential as the evidence itself. Meanwhile, prosecutors appear confident that the physical evidence supports their narrative. Throughout the trial, the state repeatedly highlighted witness accounts suggesting that tensions escalated rapidly, but did not appear to justify deadly force. Multiple students described seeing arguments, pushing, and emotional exchanges. What they did not consistently describe was an immediate, life-threatening attack. That distinction may prove critical. Under self-defense laws, jurors typically must consider whether the force used was reasonable under the circumstances as perceived by the defendant at that moment. The defense does not necessarily have to prove that danger actually existed. Rather, they often seek to establish that the defendant reasonably believed danger existed. But that legal standard becomes far more difficult when witnesses offer conflicting accounts. And that's exactly what happened throughout this trial. Some witnesses described growing tension. Others described confusion. Several testified that events unfolded so quickly, they barely understood what was happening until after the fatal injury had already occurred. According to testimony presented in court, many students initially believed they were witnessing nothing more than another brief argument between teenagers. A verbal dispute, a shove, perhaps a confrontation that would quickly end. Instead, within seconds, the situation allegedly escalated into a deadly encounter that would forever alter multiple families' lives. That speed has become a recurring theme throughout the proceedings. Again and again, witnesses described chaos. Again and again, they described confusion. And again, they described how rapidly everything happened. For the defense, that chaos may help support the argument that decisions were being made in a split second under pressure. For the prosecution, however, the same chaos may reinforce a different conclusion entirely, that no one present expected lethal violence. As legal analysts continue debating the evidence, another troubling reality has emerged. Several witnesses called by the defense did not appear to provide the overwhelming support many observers expected. In fact, some testimony created additional complications. According to courtroom reports, certain witnesses acknowledged facts that prosecutors later used to challenge key aspects of the defense narrative. At times, prosecutors appeared able to use prior statements, surveillance footage, and inconsistencies in recollections to undermine testimony that initially seemed favorable to the defense. Every criminal trial ultimately becomes a battle over credibility. Who is believable? Whose memory is accurate? Whose version of events best matches the physical evidence? And by the end of testimony, those questions remained far from settled. But if there was one moment that appeared to leave a lasting emotional impact on the courtroom, it came from testimony describing the immediate aftermath of the stabbing. Jurors reportedly heard powerful accounts from individuals who rushed to help the wounded teenager. One witness, a military veteran who had previously encountered traumatic situations during service, described efforts to save Austin Metcalf's life. Picture of confusion, urgency, and desperate attempts to keep the teenager alive until emergency responders arrived. For many observers, those moments transformed the trial from a legal debate into something deeply human. Because beyond the competing legal theories, beyond the arguments over self-defense, beyond the surveillance footage and witness statements, a young life was lost. And that reality has remained present throughout every day of testimony. Now, with evidence concluded and both sides preparing their final arguments, the focus shifts to the 12 individuals who will decide the outcome, the jurors. And what they do next could determine whether this case becomes a controversial acquittal, a conviction carrying life-altering consequences, or the beginning of an even larger national debate. Because as closing arguments approach, one question is becoming impossible to ignore. Has the defense done enough to create reasonable doubt? Or has the prosecution successfully dismantled the self-defense claim before the jury ever begins deliberating? The answer may arrive sooner than anyone expected. Part 3. As the trial moves toward its conclusion, attention is shifting away from the witnesses and toward the 12 people who now hold the future of this case in their hands: the jury. For days, jurors have sat through emotional testimony, graphic evidence, conflicting eyewitness accounts, and competing legal narratives. Now, they must answer a question that has divided observers from the very beginning. Was this an act of self-defense, or was it an unjustified killing? What makes this decision especially difficult is that both sides are asking jurors to interpret the same event in completely different ways. The prosecution argues that the evidence tells a straightforward story. According to their case, a confrontation occurred, tensions escalated, and a teenager lost his life after a knife was allegedly introduced into what witnesses largely described as a brief altercation. The defense, however, sees the same sequence of events differently. They argue that jurors must place themselves in the defendant's position at that exact moment, not with the benefit of hindsight, not after reviewing surveillance footage dozens of times, but in the middle of a rapidly developing confrontation where decisions were allegedly being made in seconds. And that distinction could ultimately determine the verdict, because criminal trials are rarely decided by public opinion. They're decided by legal standards. One of the most important standards jurors will be instructed to consider is reasonable doubt. The prosecution bears the burden of proving its case. The defense does not have to prove innocence. Instead, the defense's objective is often much narrower: create enough uncertainty that jurors cannot unanimously conclude guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That is where closing arguments become so important. After days of testimony, attorneys now have one final opportunity to shape how jurors view the evidence. And legal experts believe both sides face significant challenges. For prosecutors, the emotional impact of the case is undeniable. The loss of a young life has been a recurring theme throughout the proceedings. Witnesses described panic. Emergency responders rushed to the scene. Family members sat through painful testimony recounting the final moments before tragedy struck. But prosecutors still must ensure that emotion does not replace legal analysis. Jurors are instructed to decide cases based on evidence, not sympathy. That means prosecutors must convince the jury that the facts themselves support conviction. The defense faces a different challenge entirely. Without testimony from Carmelo Anthony himself, jurors must evaluate the self-defense claim through indirect evidence: witness statements, physical evidence, surveillance footage, attorney arguments. That strategy is not unusual. Many defendants choose not to testify for valid legal reasons. Cross-examination can be unpredictable. One poorly phrased answer can sometimes damage an otherwise strong defense. Yet, the absence of direct testimony may still leave unanswered questions in jurors' minds, questions only the defendant could have answered. What exactly was he thinking? What did he perceive in those critical moments? What level of threat did he believe existed? And most importantly, why did he believe his actions were necessary? Those questions now linger over the entire case. Meanwhile, another factor may become increasingly important once deliberations begin: witness credibility. Over the course of the trial, jurors heard numerous accounts of what happened that day. Some details matched, others conflicted. Memories differed, descriptions varied, and surveillance footage became a focal point as attorneys attempted to reconcile witness statements with what appeared on video. This is not unusual in high-stress situations. Research has repeatedly shown that eyewitness recollections can vary dramatically when people experience traumatic or chaotic events, but jurors must still decide which accounts deserve the most weight. Did witnesses accurately remember what they saw? Did time affect those memories? Did emotions influence perceptions? Or does the physical evidence provide the clearest picture of what actually occurred? Those questions could dominate jury discussions behind closed doors. And then there is the emotional evidence. Perhaps no testimony resonated more strongly than descriptions of the aftermath. The desperate attempts to save Austin Metcalf, the frantic emergency calls, the realization among students and coaches that something far more serious had happened than anyone initially believed. According to courtroom observers, those moments appeared to affect multiple jurors, not because they answered legal questions, but because they reminded everyone in the courtroom of the human cost at the center of the case. Regardless of the verdict, two families have already experienced life-changing consequences. One family is mourning the loss of a son. Another family is watching a teenager face allegations that could shape the rest of his life. That reality has created an atmosphere unlike almost any other trial this year. High profile, emotionally charged, legally complex, and deeply polarizing. Now, with testimony concluded, the focus turns entirely to closing arguments. This is where attorneys stop presenting evidence and start telling the story they want jurors to remember. Prosecutors will likely attempt to connect every piece of evidence into a single narrative. The defense will likely emphasize uncertainty, conflicting testimony, and reasonable doubt. Each side will ask jurors to view the exact same facts through a completely different lens. And somewhere inside that jury room, 12 people must decide which version they believe. But before deliberations begin, there is one final development making this case even more extraordinary. The jurors will reportedly be separated from the outside world during deliberations. No television, no social media, no news coverage, no outside influence. Only the evidence, only the law, and only each other. Which means that very soon, one of the most watched cases of the year will enter its most critical phase. And as the nation waits for a verdict, people on both sides of this debate are asking the same unsettling question. When those jury room doors finally close, what conclusion will the evidence lead them to? As closing arguments approach, the Carmelo Anthony murder trial is entering its most consequential chapter. The evidence has been presented. The witnesses have spoken. The surveillance footage has been analyzed frame by frame. And now, everything comes down to 12 jurors. For prosecutors, the final argument is expected to focus on accountability. Throughout the trial, the state has repeatedly pointed to witness testimony, physical evidence, and the deadly outcome of the confrontation itself. Their position is likely to remain straightforward. A teenager lost his life. Multiple witnesses described a confrontation that escalated rapidly, and according to the prosecution's theory, the evidence does not support the level of force that was allegedly used. The defense, however, is expected to deliver a very different message. Their task is not necessarily to prove every detail of what happened. Their objective is to create reasonable doubt, to convince jurors that uncertainty still exists, that conflicting testimony matters, that eyewitness memories can be imperfect, that split-second decisions made during moments of fear cannot always be judged through the clarity of hindsight. And that distinction could ultimately determine whether Carmelo Anthony walks free or faces life-altering consequences. But beneath the legal arguments lies something even more powerful: the emotional weight of what happened that day. For Austin Metcalf's family, this trial has meant reliving unimaginable pain. Every witness, every photograph, every piece of testimony, every description of those final moments, each one reopening wounds that may never fully heal. For Carmelo Anthony's family, the courtroom has represented a different kind of nightmare. Day after day, they have watched allegations against their son unfold before a packed courtroom and a national audience. Regardless of what verdict is eventually returned, both families have already endured consequences that will last a lifetime. And that reality has made this case one of the most emotionally charged courtroom battles in recent memory. Outside the courthouse, public debate continues to intensify. Supporters of both sides have flooded social media with competing interpretations of the evidence. Some argue the prosecution has presented a compelling case. Others believe significant questions remain unanswered. Still others warn that public opinion and legal standards are not the same thing. Because ultimately, the verdict will not be decided by commentators. It will not be decided by social media. And it will not be decided by headlines. It will be decided by 12 jurors, reviewing every piece of evidence presented inside that courtroom. Their discussions may last hours. They may last days. No one knows. But once deliberations begin, every witness statement, every surveillance clip, every expert opinion, and every argument from both sides will be scrutinized behind closed doors. And that is where this story becomes truly unpredictable. Because jury deliberations often reveal concerns that neither side expected. One juror may focus on eyewitness credibility. Another may focus on physical evidence. Others may focus entirely on whether the legal requirements for self-defense were satisfied. Sometimes, a case that appears straightforward results in intense disagreement. Other times, a complicated case produces a surprisingly quick verdict. At this moment, no one outside that jury room knows which path this case will take. What is clear, however, is that the outcome could have enormous consequences. A conviction could mean decades behind bars. An acquittal would almost certainly spark national debate. And regardless of the verdict, discussions surrounding self-defense laws, school safety, and youth violence are unlikely to end anytime soon. For now, the nation waits. The families wait. The attorneys wait. And soon, the jury will begin the difficult task of reaching a decision that could alter multiple lives forever. Because after weeks of attention, days of testimony, and countless hours of argument, this case is no longer about what attorneys believe. It's about what jurors believe. And now people across the country are asking one terrifying question. When those jurors finally return to the courtroom, will they conclude this was self-defense, or will they decide it was murder? Only time will tell. If you enjoyed this breakdown of one of the biggest courtroom cases in America, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We follow every major trial, every explosive courtroom revelation, and every verdict as it happens. And let us know in the comments, after hearing the evidence presented so far, what do you think the jury's biggest question will be during deliberations? Thanks for watching, and we'll continue following this case every step of the way.